I'm Virginia Postrel. Welcome to my podcast. My guest is Steve Teles, a political scientist at Johns Hopkins University and the Niskanen Center. In this conversation, which was recorded on September 13th, we talk about political factions. We talk about how never-Trumpers got it wrong and should have become one. We talk about the prospects of the abundance faction within the Democratic Party and why it needs to happen. We talk about where the abundance movement comes from and why scarcity developed in the 1970s. We talk about what happened when the tyranny of the majority was replaced by the tyranny of the minority and why Steve prefers the former. It's a fun conversation and the first of two with Steve. Let's get started. Hi, Steve. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me here.
Yeah. So I was reading a whole bunch of your work, and I realized we could go for about 4 or 5 hours, but so I'm going to have to try and focus it a bit. I'll start with your essay, "The Rise of the Abundance Faction," because I recommended it on my Substack. Then my husband got, as you said, triggered.
Exactly.
Wrote this very negative comment about it, which I thought was somewhat uncharitable reading, but had some valid points in it. So I thought we'd start by just asking you, what is your argument? How do you want people to understand what you're doing here?
What is my argument? Wow, that starts
what
from
is the-
first
what is-
principles.
Yeah, well, okay, let's. We don't want to
Well,
go.
no,
Yeah.
I can do it. I can work with that. So, I mean, some of this has to go back. So, in doing this kind of work, as you know, you should always be selling. So I don't have to tell a libertarian or a dynamist. I have to really be careful on that particular point.
Yeah, that's probably
that you should always be selling. But a few years ago, along with Sam Hammond and Daniel Takish, for Niskanen, I wrote a piece called Cost Disease Socialism.
Right, which was terrific, yeah.
Which was, thank you very much.
I made a very important point.
And this, I think, was a pretty early entrant into what's now thought of as the abundance sort of argument. And this was, around the same time that other people, Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein and some other people were making similar kinds of arguments that especially when you look at the kind of things that Democrats were saying they wanted to do back in 2020, almost all of those involved something where the really basic things that people have to invest in or spend on in their lives, right? Housing, education, childcare, healthcare. That everybody's sort of private balance sheet was having a hard time managing these.
Right.
And faced with that, those were also all to some degree implicating the public balance sheet as well. And I should just be open that we originally wrote this for the Peterson Foundation, which works on deficits, and we were thinking, well, what is it that we're doing that fits into that conversation?
Right.
And so to the Peterson sort of side, we were saying, if we're going to have long-term budget kind of issues,
right,
the problem is we can't solve that by putting things back onto people's private balance sheet, right? Because private balance sheet can't handle the costs they've already got, right? So if you're trying to think about solving the deficit by just cutting entitlements or transfers, that's going to be a problem because people don't have any room on their private balance sheet to handle those costs. So that was the thing we were saying in that direction, which used to be right and now is not so much anymore. And then to the left, we were saying, faced with these problems on people's private balance sheet, which is the thing that everybody was saying is the rent's too damn high, healthcare's you can't afford childcare. The answer on the left was subsidy, right? Let's try and move that onto the public balance sheet. But we were saying almost all of those, there was some basic supply constraint that was behind it, right? And so if all you do is you add subsidy to a product with constrained supply, you get increasing prices, right? That's maybe now we've gone beyond neoliberalism, and so basic arguments like that are basically just accounting conventions are no longer things we're allowed to do. But we basically said, that's just a truism, right? You
Right.
subsidize something with supply constraints and you get higher
Right,
prices.
right, right.
So
So
that
to bring it to something currently, so Kamala Harris has a proposal to give first-time home buyers a $25,000 tax credit. And digging up some old stuff, I discovered that when I was a first-time home buyer in 1992, George H.W. Bush was proposing a $5,000 tax credit for uh, first-time home buyers. That did not become law.
right,
He did not win the election with it either.
right.
But the point is, especially today when we have this very severely constrained housing market, a big tax credit like that probably is not going to help the first-time home buyer very much. It's going to help the home seller by raising the price.
Well, so I mean, this is a little bit. I mean, this one is one where I want to give her a little credit, which is, we already massively subsidize housing in all kinds of ways, right?
Right, right,
Especially with the
right,
mortgage interest deduction. And so, if we were starting de novo, right, we were all
right,
policy virgins in the housing thing, and then we were thinking about what we wanted to do. A first time housing, if we just had a fixed amount of money and it was definitely going into a subsidy, it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing to have that fixed sum of money go into a first time home buyer credit, because at least it was subsidizing the thing you're supposedly actually want to subsidize, which is to get people into the housing market, as opposed to mortgage interest, which is really subsidizing people who are already in. But the point is, when you're right now, you're just adding that on top of all the
right,
rest of the
right.
subsidy.
The point I'm making is essentially if you add that subsidy without significantly expanding supply,
Right.
it's going to be a problem.
Yes. And
And so
so,
I'm not arguing about like whether that subsidy is better or worse
yeah,
than other subsidies. The point is this supply side problem.
yeah. So, right.
Yeah,
So the argument we were making there, right, the cost disease socialism argument is that's true in all these different areas, right? Is that we subsidize things without adequately trying to actually deal with the underlying supply. And faced with this problem, most of the Democrats' proposals are just to shovel more supply on top of the things we've already got. Higher education is sort of notorious in that. Healthcare
right,
is notorious in that. So one way to think about what people mean when they mean abundance, right, is that we need to solve these underlying supply constraints. And you
right,
can push that kind of thing further than that. You can say, look, we've got problems in science, right? Our problem where we've got this general long-term productivity issue in science, and we keep trying to solve it by, let's crank up more money into NIH or NSF and whatever, right? But it turns out we have all these problems where, the investigators keep getting older. We've got all these, so we need to solve the supply constraints there. And then there's lots of other people who are like, oh, there's all kind of innovation that we could have, but we have all kind of others. That's the reason why we've got declining growth. And so the abundance kind of argument is more of everything, right?
right,
Which again
right.
would is at least rhymes with dynamism. So actually, in
Right.
preparation for this, I did my due diligence. I went back, as I told you, I went back into the archives and saw the original events that you did on The Future and Its Enemies, and I thought, wow, Virginia Poncher was super early on this. She was 25 years too early.
Yeah,
Um,
that's the story of my life. Yeah.
there you go. Well, so okay, so that's abundance. Abundance
Yeah,
is a general argument that both the left and right are getting something fundamentally wrong, right? The right, what the right was getting wrong, or at least the thing we used to call the right. This is where I have to ironize
yeah, right.
a little bit, right? Was we've got a big problem with public balance sheets. Let's solve the problem by putting things on people's private balance sheet. But if you've got supply constraints, that all that does is that doesn't necessarily push down the
Right,
cost of things. It just makes people even more miserable. And the left problem is, right, that by subsidizing it, you're only going to make it worse. And so the
Right.
abundance faction, so now we have to,
Yeah.
because you
Yeah.
asked me the question,
Yeah, I
also
know.
one
It's a big
question
question.
with 18 subsections
I
to it,
know.
is trying to think about so I'm a political scientist. I can kind of do a hand puppet that's like an economist. I'm basically a political scientist. And the political science question about this is, well, how do you do that, right? Just
Right.
making a clever argument and then writing an op-ed in the New York Times doesn't magically make things happen, right? This is, if we have, I'm enough of a public choice person to believe that you actually have to solve the underlying power problem
Right.
that's underneath. If you have bad policy, it's suggesting something about the basic arrangement of power institutions is messed up, and you have to solve that problem. And so I published a book a few years ago called Never Trump, which was, as they say in Britain, it is what's on what's on the tin, right? It was about never Trumpers. And at the end of that, we sort of, when we did the conclusion, we were thinking about, then we were thinking about, well, what happens with these never Trumpers, right? What
Right.
becomes of them? What do they do, right? And at the time, I think we were sort of disappointed that that what they really should have done is created a base of power in the Republican Party, right? Something where they were like, we are now a minority in this party, but we're a pivotal
Right.
minority, and we're going to make, and my disappointment with never Trumpers is, they never did as much as just take over the Republican Party of Fauquier County, right? If they'd done that, they would have had a lot more power. Instead, they did a lot of defending democracy as opposed to just doing democracy. And part of the insight of there is that historically, American political parties have actually been sort of factional coalitions.
Right.
When you go back into history, they, we have two parties. We've had a stable two-party system for 160 something years for basic institutional reasons.
Right.
And
the math of the constitutional arrangements lead to
although
that.
not even that, right? I
more or
mean,
less,
you could create multi-member districts in states. South Carolina could go and say, we're just going to have multi-member districts, right? And we're going to have, which would make it a lot easier to have third parties, but nobody does that.
Actually, South Carolina couldn't. It used to.
Oh, really?
But it was deemed illegal under the Voting Rights Act.
There you go. Well,
and one man, one vote. But
right.
yeah.
Okay. So the basic theory here
Right.
is, traditionally in American politics, if you look at Holland and you go and look at their parties, right? They've got like a million parties that
Right.
all have representation in the legislature, including my favorite is the Party for Animals, right? So there's a party called the Party for Animals. And, again, they're what they say they are. They're for animals, right? And they actually have representation in the legislature. We obviously have a lot more diversity than Holland does, but we've only got two parties. And we manage that by having factions, right? We have organization inside of the parties. And if you think back to when you were a girl in South Carolina, right? We had a Southern Democratic faction, not necessarily the most hygienic group of gentlemen. But, that was a part of the way the Democratic Party worked, is it was a set of Southern Democrats, Union Democrats, African Americans, right? And they were all sort of organized on their own. And what the party did as a collectivity was the result of the negotiation between those factions. And so what we argue in that is that what's weird about the last 20 or 30 years of American history is our parties have become more homogenous, right? They lack a lot of that factional structure. And as a result, it's a lot easier for the parties to get moved one way or the other ideologically, and it's a lot easier for them to get controlled by their ideological extremes, because other parts of that party coalition, even if they're the voters, they don't necessarily have a lot of organizational structure to advance their interests. And so the argument of faction is that that's aberrant, that's unusual, and it's not going to last, and that we're entering into a more factional era, and that you can see that in the Democratic Party by the rise of the DSA, people like AOC and Ayanna Pressley, right? They're
Right.
building that factional
Yeah.
structure on the left.
Right.
And the question is, would other factions? So there's the sort of old Koch Democratic Party of the Joe Bidens and people like that, right? And that's like a coalition of interest groups.
Right.
They're now sharing power with a left in the form of what I call the DSA faction.
Right.
And now I'm finally getting to the answer to your question,
It's
right?
good.
An abundance faction is our theorizing about what the other complementary faction inside this would be, right? And the last thing I'll say on this is a little bit of an attempt to theorize something other than moderation, right?
Yeah.
So what we're not saying is this faction is going to be more moderate, because that assumes, a single dimension issue space.
Right. Yeah.
Again, which is, talking to anybody who, at least I'll just say, is like, has hung out with libertarians, right? They hate the single dimension issue space, right? And I actually think there's space for another form of organization,
right,
in some ways off of that, right? And abundance, in a way, is another dimension that's in a way an alternative to the existing dimension on which the old Koch part of the Democratic Party and the DSA faction are.
Right. Yeah, because I mean, I think moderation, it's also sort of an empty term in the sense of moderate compared to what. And I mean, it sort of made sense in the Democratic leadership, Bill Clinton kind of way where it was just moved closer to the center to get the median voter, but as you point out in writing about that, that was basically a coalition of politicians who were looking for ways to win. And what you're envisioning with the abundance faction is not that. It's something that starts with people who are enthusiastic about a particular goal, abundance, which is many goals, but it's a general.
Right.
And then over time, win over politicians to come, be on their side,
let's go back
be their representative.
Just to drill down into that example a little bit, right? So when you think about the thing people call the Democratic Leadership Council, which starts in the 1980s, it's really started by primarily by elected officials, mostly in the South or the border, right? Who are in the middle of this big realignment that's happening in American politics. And, they're stuck inside this party that at the top has sort of moved to their left. And that's making it really hard for them to figure out electorally how to manage in their own, because they're not segregationists, right? They're not those people, right? But they want to win. They want to win with a cross-racial coalition. But they, and so, there are people like, sorry to keep picking on South Carolina, but we have a South Carolina connection, right? It's like John Spratt, who was a congressman from South Carolina, right? What he needed was an alternative brand, right? The Democratic brand was kind of like ritually impure. So he needed like a kosher brand that he could associate himself with. So we could say when he was running in Greenville and Charleston and more rural places, you might not like that Yankee Democratic Party, but we got our own DLC thing going on here. So think about me in that sense. Don't think about me like the national brand, right? And Bill Clinton, to some degree, leveraged off of that. He helped produce that. He was very, very involved in the DLC too. But he also benefited from that because there was a well-recognized brand that he could point to. But they didn't really primarily have their own ideological program. They didn't have they didn't start with an agenda, right? They added some stuff, national service, EITC, and there were people who tried to sort of backward, engineer that thing that was for politicians into an ideological program, which is a little bit like what the national conservatives are doing with Trump. Right. There was a thing that was done for kind of electoral purposes, and then they tried to say, well, that was actually always about whatever. Right. Whereas our theory is the abundance idea is something that really starts with intellectuals. It really starts with ideas. It starts with people who got a policy program. If you think about the OG version of this is is YIMBY, is the people who want more housing. That's people who've got like an actual policy they're trying to pass
Right.
in the, I actually think in some ways you can go back further and think about a lot of the school reform stuff as
Yeah,
being an
charter
early,
schools, that sort of thing.
but
Yeah,
that's
we're gonna.
all about, we've got a supply problem, we've got a cartel that controls the
Right,
supply, right? In a way, it rhymes a lot with the later
right,
stuff.
right.
But the structure of this is different in that you're starting with the policy and the idea, and then gradually it's infecting, policymakers who are uncomfortable with the existing set of things that are on offer, but they had no name for the thing and they had no
Yeah,
sense of a collective action that
right,
they'd be part of something else, right? So
right.
abundance is a little bit like, the policy love that dare not speak its name. So it's trying to create
Yeah,
a
yeah.
name for
Right,
that thing that
right.
people knew was a vacuum that they,
Yeah, yeah. I was at a Breakthrough Institute conference a couple months ago, and they're definitely part of this sort of
yeah, there are
abundance.
comrades. Yeah.
I mean, they are, first of all, when you go to one of their conferences, although they have a few token non-Democrats, Steve Hayward being
Yep.
their sort of leading light, I guess, in that part, it is very much like these are Democrats talking to Democrats for the most part. I mean, they had Celinda Lake talk, and it was
Yep.
all about like, how do you get at that point, how do you get Joe Biden reelected? What messages might work. But one of the things that one of the points I made in this sort of open free for all and sort of people making comments at the end was that when I wrote The Future and Its Enemies back in the 90s, I really didn't foresee the rise of the abundance faction within the environmental movement, because everything was about not doing stuff, controlling energy, what's now the degrowth
Right.
faction. It was all about stasis or reversal. And so the idea that now you have this faction within the environmental movement and within the Democratic Party, although not only within the Democratic Party, that is they're very concerned with climate change, but they're not using it as an excuse to try to make us poor and miserable.
Right.
They're trying to say, we want solar and wind, but we also want nuclear, geothermal. Energy abundance is really important to a flourishing society, and so we need to find ways to have abundant energy that is, not contributing to climate change. Anyway,
Yeah. So it's funny actually. I listened to part of that conference. Just you mentioned Steve Hayward.
yeah,
I have to say, so I listened to his talk, and I've known Steve for a long time. Um, when he had somewhat more wholesome allies than he has now. But he had a great line where he said, I just wanted to recognize this conference is being held on the ancestral land of Michael Schellenberger. I thought that
right,
was an
right, yeah,
all-time great
yeah,
speech comment. But yeah, I definitely think it's one thing. I think also the abundance, that what the idea does is and this gets to what ideas do in politics in general, right? Is they often connect things that might look like discrete projects, right?
hmm
But they add them up into one thing. So there's
right,
people working on energy and environment, like people at Breakthrough. There are people working on housing. There's people who are, as I said, it was working on education, right? You can go through a bunch of these things,
right,
and on their own, they're sort of like interest group forms of organization.
right, right,
Um, and that can be one form of influence, is working within your policy
right,
silo. But one thing that doesn't mostly do is mobilize or organize people, right? And it doesn't give them pivotal power inside the party system, right? And so one of the things that we're really emphasizing here is that this is an idea that at least provides the basis to envision another another kind of entrant into the negotiations over the agenda of the Democratic Party for certain. And there's an open question about the Republican Party,
Yeah,
which maybe
right.
we'll come
A
back
lot
to.
depends on what
And
happens this year,
right.
maybe.
Well, yeah. I mean,
And there's state and local Republican parties too, which this might be.
yes, right.
Yeah,
And again, one thing also is, traditionally in American politics, a lot of those factions were regional, right? So you go
yeah,
back into the 19th century, and like all
right,
of our politics is all sectional.
right,
Everything's
right, right.
right, and it's not just the South, which both of us know very well. Right?
Free silver,
There's
this,
weird Western, parties, which are created by the fact of where they are geographically in a spatial economy around like railroads. Like the reason that they're all organizing in a somewhat populist way is they want to get their stuff to market. And so, right, that's where the antitrust and
right,
regulation stuff
right.
all comes from. In that sense, our politics is less sectional than it used to be.
Yeah,
But it's easy to imagine that, especially this abundance idea, could have more capture in certain kind of places than others, and that it could provide the basis for factional competition. So, just to give you one really quick example, there's lots of parts of this country where there is only one party, right? So we talk about
right.
two-party
I live
system.
in one.
Yeah, right. So, I always describe America as having a two-party system at most.
Yeah,
Just like, that what is it? The Unitarians believe in one God at most, right? We have
right, right, right.
two parties at most. And so in that sense, right, there's also a fundamental democratic problem here, right?
Right.
Which is
Yeah,
what's going to provide political
yeah,
competition in places where there's only one party, because
right,
parties are generally how we provide the basic
right.
mechanism. This is why, E. Schatzsnyder famously said there's no such thing as democracy without parties, right? And so one theory here is that abundance is almost necessarily the axis on which competition in those blue cities in Los Angeles and DC and New
Yeah,
York, or I live in Tacoma Park, Maryland, which is this small,
yeah.
very
DC
left
suburb.
suburb of DC, right? Everybody is a Democrat other than one guy I know works for Mercatus. There's one guy from Cato, but all those people are on the DL, right?
Yeah, right.
But there's a lot of issues in our community and also all these other places that are things that really do divide
Yeah,
Democrats in part
yeah,
generationally, right? So a lot of the housing stuff is between older people who grew up with one generation of environmentalism, which is closer to what you were talking about, the
right.
environmentalism
Exactly.
that just don't do anything.
Yeah,
And we have a younger generation who would define environmentalism more around climate than some of these others, which gives you another way of thinking about
yeah.
housing. So these people are like, we should be building the housing here, not out in Frederick,
Right,
or
right.
places like that. And so I think that's why my theory is that abundance is going to start politically in a more powerful way in these local or municipal bases, because that's where you're really directly facing the enemy
Right.
in some sense.
Yeah, yeah. No, I can definitely see it. Well, first of all, you already see it on housing in California in general and LA specifically, as well as the Bay Area. But
And
I
on
could
energy,
definitely,
right? On the
yeah,
nuclear
yeah,
power
it's
in
starting
California.
to
That's a
build
big,
on energy. Right now, it's the the pro nuclear faction or whatever you want to call it, part of the abundance thing, is still primarily an intellectual thing, as opposed to YIMBY, which has gotten to the activist stage, and there are, you know, they're getting politicians and stuff. Unfortunately, Scott Wiener, who's been the leading guy in the legislature doing great work on housing, has turned out to be like terrible on AI, which we
right?
don't need to get into, but it's like, whoa, man, that's not good. We wanted to
Yeah.
like you.
We should talk about AI though, because I have a theory about AI that actually puts it on the other side of abundance. But let's keep
Okay,
going with
yeah,
where you were
yeah.
going.
We may need to. So the big question, and this is the one thing that I thought Steve raised a legitimate concern about. And it's a concern that all of us who are thinking about abundance, the progress movement, which is a little, if abundance is like the sort of left, these are all center left,
Yeah.
the left tilted way of phrasing it. Progress is maybe a little bit right tilted.
Right.
But you know, the time to build, Mark Andreessen thing. I mean, there is this question. There is this incredible frustration with all the constraints, all the veto players. And I think there's widespread consensus, even among even among the general public, that we're not getting the government we're paying for. This is annoying. Why can't the government do anything? Why can't it fix the potholes? Why are the sidewalks in LA all screwed up? These sorts of things. But all of those things came from someplace. They were not imposed upon the world by diabolical fiends. They came from a reaction / overreaction to what had gone before. So how do we avoid, if we want to have abundance, how do we avoid just plowing up people's neighborhoods and disrupting their lives for the sake of, whatever a bunch of smart people think we should have?
Yeah. So, a couple things to say on this.
I know you
One
have more
is
than a
right. So,
couple, but
I mean, I think sometimes it's a little too easy to overstate how much of the thing that people are talking about, that's the horror that was created. People can
yeah,
retell stories about Robert Moses over and
yeah.
over again, right? Whereas like when you go to heaven and you look at Robert Moses's ledger, it's a pretty good ledger.
But I
I would,
actually think that partially because of the influence of Robert Caro's biographies
yeah,
and because so many people live in New York, it's overstated that Robert Moses is the guy.
right,
This happened everywhere.
right.
It
No, so
happened in Greenville, South Carolina, for God's sake. It happened, it
I mean, although
happened in LA. It happened.
I guess I would say though, I think in some cases we might be overstating what was a one-time thing generated by the technology of the highway, right? That's so many, not all the stuff that people are talking about is really just downstream from highways, but huge amount of it's downstream from highways. And so,
Some of, I mean, that's the abundance faction answer. The problem is we
well,
like cars,
well,
which is
no,
a
no, no. I never said that.
I
I
know
never
you
said
didn't,
that.
but
Don't push me into your ideological pigeonhole,
I
lady.
didn't,
All
I
right.
wasn't attributing that to you. I was
Well,
saying that you get that a lot from
okay. Let me
urbanist
speak up on
types.
the answer then.
Yeah,
Okay. Which is that one, I do think that a lot of the legal and participatory structure that we're talking about was created in a period when nobody really knew what it was going to add up into, right?
oh,
So when you
that's
think about
definitely true.
in
Yeah,
housing,
yeah,
right, you think about the historic preservation zones. Like, so I'm sitting in one right now. I'm in a historic preservation zone, right? And that creates all kind of constraint on your ability to build, to subdivide
right,
housing. That's not about some big government, right?
right, right,
That's now again that would constrain if you wanted to do something or help people consolidate. It would be
right,
hard.
right,
But I do think a lot of people, when they created the legal infrastructure of participation, of CEQA, of NEPA, of all these sort of laws that create opportunities
right.
for blockage. So one thing I'll say is that's worse than majority tyranny is minority tyranny,
Yeah, right,
right?
right.
And
And
so
these are often extremely small
yeah,
minorities,
and so that's one
six
thing.
people in a
Right.
city of millions.
Yeah, so I would say that one problem is my theory, this may not be yours, right, is I do think that a dynamic capitalist society needs basic infrastructure, right? And basic infrastructure inevitably creates winners and losers, right?
Right,
And
yeah,
that somebody and that because of the technological and other imperatives, somebody, has to be the one who sort of sets the
right,
agenda and
right,
says, okay, here's what we're gonna build, right? This can get rejected or pushed back, right? But we do actually have democratic
Right. Yeah.
mechanisms
Right.
in place, right? That
Yeah.
can address that. And so we've traded one genuine problem for an even worse problem, right? We traded minority tyranny for minority tyranny,
Right.
right? And so
Right.
I would rather go back to majority tyranny, right? And today we do have fairly well organized groups of people who can actually push back against projects that arguably are
Right.
problematic
Right.
on a lot of these dimensions. So
Right.
I actually think that
Yeah.
that democratic problem is less
Well,
severe than it would have been at one point.
yeah. I think I would raise another thing that's very rarely talked about, which is that there was a change in the law. There was, I don't mean legislation. There was a Supreme Court ruling, which I'm afraid I do not know the name of, which permitted the use of eminent domain for what were essentially private purposes. So it was not to build highways, it was to clear slums
Right.
and then sell or give the land to developers who would do something better. So that's not infrastructure. And it seems to me that if you, as far as I know, very little in the conservative legal movement, which you've also written about, has focused on that. There has been some. There are people who
Yeah.
have worked on property rights issues, but it seems like if you could roll that back and get it to where you really are talking about public goods, public infrastructure, not anything that you can come up with slums are bad for
Right.
the
No,
city,
yeah, look, I agree with that, right? But then now
Yeah,
you're using a scalpel, right, to address the problem. So, I actually was very sympathetic to the minority in Kilo, which is I think the
right.
case
Yeah, right,
you're talking about, which is about takings for private
right,
purposes, right?
right.
That yeah, I actually think that I also think those have a very different kind of
Yeah,
politics, right? That is, because again, I'm
right,
basically sympathetic to markets, right? And I
right.
don't necessarily think the holdout problem for private development is really the big thing
People
that slows
overcome
down.
that every day.
Right.
Um,
So I actually think now I think for common carrier public
right.
infrastructure kind of stuff right now again there's a lot of other reasons why our public infrastructure is so hard to build
Yeah,
because again there's lots of countries that in some sense are ideologically to our left that
right,
build faster cheaper than
right. Yeah,
we do,
yeah.
right?
No, there's,
Spain, or Italy, which people do not usually put up as a
yeah,
model of public, of government quality, right? They build train lines and stuff all the time.
right, right.
Now, part of that I think is simply that they've solved the coordination problem through corporatism, right?
Yeah,
Which is that there's a certain set of interests that are well understood to have to
right,
basically control that domain.
right.
There's a rent there. Somebody's getting a rent, right?
Yeah.
But they get the rent when they get it done, right? And
So
that's
yeah, so
the
you
thing,
don't
right?
have the bullet train to nowhere. And
Yeah.
I mean, what we've done is we give those rents to people who do endless, to lots of lawyers and people who
Right.
do
Is you have to
consultants and
sue your way,
people who do endless amounts of paperwork
right?
along the way. So there's still people getting rents and big
Right.
bucks rents, but it's not the
Right.
people
But
who
let
are
me
actually building stuff.
right, but let me speak up for rents for a second. That is, some of these are things. So if you
I
think
guess
about
we should define rents for those who are not
well, okay,
used to.
I can actually just do this
Yeah,
without
yeah,
even having to use a technical term, right? So, imagine that you're in DC somewhere, right? And you're in a community that really needs some kind of public goods. It needs a new
right,
pool. It
right,
needs the soccer field fixed. Now you're as a activist, you got to figure out how are we going to get that, right?
right,
Well, one way is somebody wants to develop something and you say, no, we're not going to build this thing, right? We're going to stand in the way. And then, right, you've sort of used our participatory mechanisms such that people are, okay, well, how do we get you to stop? And then you say, I want a pool, right? But what they really wanted was a pool. And they, in many cases, they had a perfectly good democratic argument for why they should get a pool, right?
Right.
But in our system, we create incentives for delay to
Right.
get that public good. You can
Right.
imagine, right, more law-like mechanisms. This is where I turn sort
Right.
of Hayekian, right, which
Right.
is I'd rather just have laws that say if you build X amount of housing,
Right.
right, then there will be Y amount of resources for public
Right.
goods.
Right.
But you
Right.
only get them when the housing built. And now you've totally inverted the incentives, right?
Right.
Now the people who want the pool are part of the coalition for getting it built,
Yeah.
as opposed to the coalition for keeping it from getting built.
Right. 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 That's an interesting way to think about it. Yeah. And I think you would find in places where growth is a good word as opposed to a bad word. So this is going back to my experience, growing up in a poorer part of the country. A lot of it does work that way, formally or informally. It's sort of like, well, if we can, get a new plant here, and we're gonna, then people will build a lot of houses, and the tax base will expand, and the city government will use that money to provide, or the school district or whatever, the schools and the roads and the various things that come along with an
Right.
increase in population.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, all those places, places like, Greenville really did have this growth machine dynamic. Now, those can also be weird because in some sense they're all borrowing against a thing that
Right,
hasn't
right,
come into
right,
being.
right, right.
So that's one of these things where if it works, then everyone thinks you're a visionary. If it doesn't work, then
Yeah,
everyone thinks
yeah.
you're a crook.
And there is a little bit of, there is a type of corruption. I lived in Dallas for 7 years, and it was interesting having come from LA and then went back to LA. And Dallas was booming and things were getting done, and it was not difficult to build housing, and there was infrastructure, and everything sort of kept up. And there was no question that there were some, business politician alliances where people were cozy and people were making money out of it. But for the average citizen, they felt like they were more or less getting, you know, the government wasn't super expensive and they were getting stuff from it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say, and this is where I also think a little bit about when I think go all the way back to half an hour ago, wherever we were talking about sort of an abundance faction. Part of an abundance faction is also thinking about what are the sort of fundamental interests, that it's not just a
Right.
bunch of people with ideas or activists, right? That one thing structurally that's been going on is that business really was this anchor tenant in the Republican Party for a long
Yeah.
time. And one effect of Trump was to really shake that, right? Is that, the Chamber of Commerce started endorsing some Democrats, which in that previous model was just totally verboten. It was
Right.
not the
Right.
thing that you do. And that I think was partially a reflection of the fact that, significant parts of business, because of, trade protection, immigration, some of these other things, was shaking their alliance with the Republican
Right. Right.
Party. So the Democratic Party is going to be facing at least some stream of people who in another era would have naturally been Republicans. And there's a question of where those people go.
Right.
And I think they more naturally go into not the Democratic Party as such, right?
Right.
But into the faction that's mostly organized around building things, making things happen, right? That
Right.
is a natural kind of cultural fit. But
Right.
part of the argument I also have is the intellectual stuff matters because you have to sort of define the terms on which those people will come into
Right.
the
Right.
Democratic Party.
Well, one of your big themes, which is also one of my big themes, going back at least as far as the future and its enemies, but actually probably farther, is that the real thing we need to worry about if we're concerned about the size and scope of government is regulation. It's not redistribution. And I would say one of the points that I make in a whole paragraph in the Future and Its Enemies is that, people who are on the dynamist side might disagree about redistribution. And what I personally would say is that there are forms and types of it that are problematic, and there are also levels. Like at some point, the quantity becomes the quality, or whatever. If you make marginal taxes really high, that creates all kinds of distortions. Everybody is eating out all the time because it's a business deduction. They can deduct it from their
Right.
taxes, or it's not taxable. And that actually happens in places like Scandinavia. It's not, but anyway, that's as a side. But the real core, the thing we need to worry about the most, is regulation. Yeah.
So this is where, so so at Niskanen, where I'm a senior fellow,
Right.
a number of the people who started Niskanen had come out of the libertarian movement. Brink Lindsay, my co-author, was a VP at Cato. A bunch of people had been come from that world. And, there were people who had choice words about people who came from them, but you were always like, people would always be like, well, Virginia Prestrel, like, and none of what we're saying applies to her, right? I always thought we should have like little like Madonnas of you, but you were sort of the paleo Niskanenite, in that was
Wouldn't that
really,
be Bill Niskanen?
there you go. But anyway, if you would ever like to pose for our thing of you, doing that, we would definitely be open for that, because that's a lot of what I think was our diagnosis too. Now I would push it a little further than you would, because yours is a slightly grudging one, which is redistribution.
The evil truth about me is that I don't really care about this. Redistribution per se does not bother me. That's heresy. Certain forms of it, if they develop certain pathologies, or I can find redistributionary programs that I want to get rid of or reform in various ways, but I'm not per se against redistribution. Of course, neither was Hayek, which is why he's like verboten in certain circles.
That's why, although I'll still stick to the argument that you're a little grudging, right? At least compared to us, right? That is
Well, I'm not actively advocating for, well, I'm certainly not actively advocating for childcare credits, which I think fall into the whole problem with,
But again, that obviously, that's where, one of the reasons that we like general redistribution, right, is that general redistribution doesn't have the effect of creating those costs, those sort of those problems.
But I am a fan of the EITC, for example. I think the EITC is.
I really like child benefit. I actually think child benefit is great, right? Because the only thing it potentially makes you create more of is something that I think there's a good reason for more of, but that's a whole other.
Well, that's the whole problem. Is like we can all come up with things we like more of,
Well, I'm just children, but
people book buying.
No, but anyway, so let me finish the argument, which is that part of our argument is that we do believe that if what you want, right, is dynamism, right, you want to have step on the gas, right, that does create lots of different forms of social upheaval, right, and the worst outcome is where people have an incentive to like throw the thing into the machine, right? And stop it, right? But this is why I've always thought that libertarianism didn't work just sociologically, right? That what you get is you get populism, right? That's the worst possible outcome, is you get various forms of either trade protection or other things when people are faced with more change than they can handle. And that socializing, and I'll just use it, right? Socializing the costs of in various ways of people adapting to that is part of the package of wanting dynamic market and technological economies, right? So it's a positive good. It's not just something that's not as bad as you think,
Right.
right? And that, but anyway, so this is why I always thought
Yeah.
that you were like a
Right.
paleo
Well,
Niskanenite.
yeah, well, I have been known to say in recent years, and this actually has come up in the context of talking about the literal Luddites in the history of textiles and stuff. But I have been known to remark in speeches that, look, if it requires farm subsidies for us to have industry, let's have farm subsidies.
Right.
Even though farm subsidies are a touchstone, oh, the evil of farm subsidies for, not only libertarians, but a lot of liberals and fiscal conservatives and basically everybody who's not a farmer or a senator from a farm state or trying to run for president in Iowa. It's like a good government cause, but in a way that is a buying people off. And eventually, we're going to run out of time, but eventually, I want to write about a bigger problem, which is that people want to believe that their work is valuable, even when it is not economically valuable, and that money alone may not do it for buying off the
Yeah.
populace.
And you should definitely talk to Brink.
Oh,
Lindsay is
yeah,
running
he's
the
got
book.
a whole thing. Yeah, right. That was
So he's got a whole, and Brink and I at this point are just like an old married couple. We're basically just one brain now that's just differentiated by byline.
right,
Um,
right.
okay, so what else do you got? What else you got for me?
Well, since we're coming to the end, I need to go to my end question, but I'll
Oh,
definitely have you on again and we'll talk about some of these other work because I want to get to the academic sectarianism
okay.
piece that you wrote as well. But my end question is, what do you recommend people to read? It may or may not have anything to do with what we've talked about today, but it could, and that could be books, it could be publications, it could be websites. What do you think people should be reading?
So I'll give you, again, you should read everything I've written,
Yes, right.
everything at the Niskanen Center. So that's definitely where you should start. I also think, Jerusalem Demsis just came out with a book
Yes.
that collects all of her articles on housing. I definitely recommend you do that. A weird one I would recommend is a guy I've gotten to know really well named Daniel Davies, or
Uh-huh.
actually in Britain it's Daniel Davis, but if you looked
Okay.
it up in that way, it
But
wouldn't come up. It's
right, right.
um, and he has a book that recently came out called The Unaccountability Machine. That's basically about one of the reasons why do we have sort of persistent organizational dysfunction in
Mm-hmm.
society. And a lot of this is about systems analysis, but one thing he talks about in various places, and this goes back a little bit to some of the things we were talking about earlier, is when you think about why is it that we don't build infrastructure well and cheaply and fast.
Mm-hmm.
One answer, which I'm sympathetic to, is just the regulatory one, except it's the way we regulate the public sector, right?
Right,
Which is then
right.
is
Yeah.
something that goes all, if you go all the way back to James Q. Wilson. I regularly teach James Q. Wilson's book Bureaucracy, which is
Bureaucracy. Yeah.
just and the thing he ends on is to say most of the dysfunction of what we dislike about government are due to constraints that we ourselves put on government, right?
Right.
So he was the OG government deregulator. And so that's one argument, right? Is we regulated government too much, but the other problem, and this is where I think that this is a kind of unintended consequence of efforts to control government, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
the privatization, at least of some of the higher level functions of government, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not the sort of the more simple, like the people who collect trash or janitors or other stuff, right? But we privatized. We didn't get rid of these things out of government, right? But we pushed a
Right.
lot of their running into the private sector, where they're being dealt with through contracts as opposed to through hierarchies, right?
So what are you thinking about? Like private prisons,
No,
military
I
contractors?
think when infrastructure, right, is so much of the basic planning of infrastructure now is not being planned inside of government, right? We create contracts with outsiders who then do that. So the knowledge never really builds up or accumulates inside of government, right? To the degree to which it accumulates at all, it accumulates in firms that government deals with through contracts,
Right.
who often hire on an hourly basis. And so
Right.
as I've been thinking about the
So
infrastructure
this is
problem,
more like actual, say consultants. These are not the people who are literally building the highways. These
Well, I
are
mean, the people who are literally building the highway often not, and that's a good argument that
because in
that
some
stuff
of
ought to
these
be
foreign
part of it.
countries that have done a really good
Yeah,
job, they actually have, I mean,
yeah,
Bob Poole, my old boss, could do
yeah.
this in
Yeah,
detail,
I
but
knew you were going to go Bob Poole on me. Yeah,
they have these kind of um, uh, build, operate, maintain kind of like the
right.
road is owned by the government, but
Yeah,
and the construction is maybe partly funded by it, depends, but then they can do tolls and they can
right.
recoup it has a sort of market
Yeah,
mechanism to it, but it's not purely private.
right. But again, this is where I don't know that. I mean, for most of the cases, the problem is and this is the problem we have almost uniquely in the U.S. is that the higher level sophisticated stuff, the things where somebody really needs to be doing the basic strategic, design kind of stuff, not the who's pouring the concrete and whatever,
Right,
right?
right.
There's a good argument that we don't have enough privatization of that, but we have too much privatization of, and this is why there's a good argument in defense contracting, costs have gone up
Yeah,
because
right,
we kept pushing those people
right,
who've ever like bent metal out
right,
into and we can only deal with them contracting. And like lots of things that about technology, things improved through learning, right? You do
right,
things and
right,
you get
right,
better at it, but this creates a kind of basic breakdown in that process by which organizations acquire new information and new knowledge. And this is where I think there is an argument that some of that really needs to reside in the state. And that's one
hmm
thing that Davies deals with in this
hmm
book are the ways we've created systems that are so complicated that we both don't get learning and they're hard to control. So
right,
that's the one thing I'll give you
right.
before
And the
we.
name of that book again
It's
is
called The
just
Unaccountability Machine,
okay. Yeah.
which is actually available in Britain. It's going to be coming out in a U.S. edition, I know, in March. So
Okay.
your
Yeah.
listeners
All
out
right.
there will be able to go and buy it.
Yeah. Great. Well, I know you have a hard stop deadline, and unfortunately, we had some tech difficulties getting started. So we'll wrap up there with plans to talk more at a later date.
Yeah, well, next time we can do the 8-hour marathon one with like
I mean, I'm
breaks
really
for
disappointed we
cocktails.
didn't get to the academic sectarianism thing. So maybe we'll schedule the next one sooner rather than later if you're
Happy to do
available.
it.
Thanks for joining me for this conversation with Steve Teles. Please check out the show notes for information on some of the things we talked about. This was the first of 2 conversations with Steve. In the next episode, we'll discuss the problem of academic sectarianism and why and how university departments should recruit grad students and professors with a broader range of political views. To read my work and hear more podcasts, subscribe to my newsletter at vpostrel.substack.com. Check out my YouTube channel, youtube.com/@vpostrel, which includes a podcast playlist. You can also subscribe to Virginia's podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get podcasts. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.